Everyone's obsessed with millennials who can't afford houses. Everyone's writing think pieces about Gen Z and their situationships and their crypto wallets. Boomers get blamed for everything. They get entire documentaries. There are podcasts, Reddit threads, TikTok callouts, a whole industrial complex dedicated to analyzing what boomers did wrong and what millennials are suffering for it. But there's a generation sitting right in the middle that almost nobody talks about. A generation of Australians who quietly built more personal wealth per capita than almost any other demographic on Earth, and who are also the most financially anxious people in the room at any given dinner party. A generation that watched their parents buy a house on a single income, expected to do the same, and then got absolutely blindsided by the 1990s. Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, the forgotten generation. And the reason their money habits look so strange to everyone around them isn't laziness or greed or some personality flaw. It's something much more specific than that. They were trained for a world that stopped existing right when they showed up to claim it. You know the type. You probably grew up with one. Your uncle who owns 3 investment properties, drives a 2009 Camry, and still turns off every light in the house before he leaves a room, like the electricity bill is personally coming for him. He's worth well over $1 million on paper, and he will stress about a $40 car service. Or your older colleague at work. She maxes out her super contributions every single year without fail, has a spreadsheet for literally everything, and still won't buy a coffee at the cafe downstairs because, and she said this out loud, I don't know what's coming. She's 52. Or maybe it's your mum's friend, the one who put her kids through private school, goes on an overseas holiday every 2 years, lives in a nice suburb, and genuinely cannot tell you, with any certainty, whether she feels financially secure. She'll hedge. She'll say, we're okay for now. The for now does a lot of work in that sentence. These people aren't confused. They're not bad with money. They are, in fact, operating from a completely coherent internal logic. One that was written in a very specific, very painful decade. Picture this. It's 1988. You're 22 years old. You grew up watching your dad work the same job for 30 years. You watched your parents buy a house, have it mostly paid off by the time you were a teenager, and retire comfortably on a combination of savings and a government pension that was basically just there, like gravity, a constant, a given. You finished school, maybe did a trade, maybe went to uni, maybe went straight into a job at a bank or a factory or an insurance firm. Didn't matter. The formula was the same. Work hard, stay loyal, buy a house. Super takes care of itself. Government's got your back. That was the deal. That was the implicit contract between your generation and the society you were handed. Interest rates are high, sure, but wages are decent, job security is real, and the path is visible. You can see it from where you're standing. You can almost touch it. You are not anxious. You are a young Australian with a plan, and the plan makes sense, and it has worked for every adult you have ever known. You believe, genuinely, deeply believe, that if you do the right things will happen to you. That's not naive. That's just how the world works. Flash forward to 1991. Same person, different circumstances. The recession hits. And not in an abstract, markets are down way. In a your boss just called you into a room way. In a the company's been restructuring way. In a we're really sorry but way. Unemployment in Australia spikes above 10%. Interest rates, which had been climbing through the late 80s, had already hit 17% by 1989, meaning anyone who'd bought a house the year before was now hemorrhaging money on a mortgage they'd taken out because that's what you do. That was the plan. That was the formula. The formula broke. And here's what's important to understand. This wasn't just a financial setback. It was a worldview collapse. The contract, the one your parents had lived by, the one you'd staked your early adult life on, turned out to be written in sand. The government didn't catch you. The job wasn't permanent. The house became a liability before it became an asset. That betrayal, that specific, formative experience of trusting a system and having it pull the rug at the exact moment you needed it most, shaped every financial decision they'd make for the rest of their lives. Every Single, 1. Here's the first weird thing about Australian Gen X and their money. They are statistically excellent savers. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has consistently found that Gen X holds more in superannuation balances and investment properties than either boomers or millennials at comparable life stages. They are objectively doing well. And yet, a Finder survey from just a few years ago found that Gen X Australians report higher financial stress levels than younger generations, despite higher average net worth. They worry more than people with less. Psychologists call this emotional scarring, or more formally, financial trauma, imprinting. When your nervous system learns that security can vanish without warning, it doesn't update that belief. Just because the bank balance improves, the brain that got burned in 1991 doesn't fully trust the 2024 spreadsheet. Safety is a feeling, not a number. And for Gen X, that feeling got calibrated in a recession. This is not irrational. If you personally experience financial freefall as a young adult, when you were most vulnerable, when you had no fallback, when your whole framework for how life worked just crumbled, you'd also develop a threshold for safe that looks extreme to people who haven't been there. Here's the second weird thing. Gen X Australians are deeply, almost pathologically, suspicious of financial institutions. And they're also among the most heavily invested in those same institutions. They've got the super, they've got the negatively geared properties, they've got the managed funds, they've got financial advisors, and they don't trust any of it. Research out of the University of Melbourne has found that Gen X investors show significantly higher rates of what's called monitoring anxiety, compulsively checking balances, over-diversifying to the point of inefficiency, holding cash buffers that are objectively too large for their risk profile. The psychological mechanism here is called institutional mistrust, a learned wariness of systems that have previously failed you. And Gen X didn't just get the 1990 recession. They got the 2008 GFC right when they were hitting peak earning years. They got the managed investment scheme collapses of the early 2000s. They got Storm Financial. They watched neighbours lose retirement savings they'd been building for decades. Of course, they watched the account balance like a hawk. They were promised things before by people in suits with products that sounded solid. They know what it looks like right before it falls apart. The third pattern, and this one surprises people, is that Australian Gen X has a wildly complicated relationship with property. They obsess over it. They've arguably driven more of Australia's property culture than any other demographic. And at the same time, many of them carry a quiet, almost superstitious dread about it. Property research, from CoreLogic and various economic bodies, points to Gen X as the dominant cohort of multiple property holders in Australia. They found it worked. They put their faith in bricks. But here's what you don't hear about. The ones who bought before 1990 and watched negative equity swallow their savings. The psychological phenomenon at work is called loss aversion asymmetry. The pain of losing something you worked for is roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. For people who got burned early, property doesn't feel like wealth. It feels like a wager. Picture this. 1992. You're sitting at a kitchen table with your partner. You've got a letter from the bank. Your house is worth less than you owe on it. You've both got jobs, and you're doing the maths on a piece of paper, trying to figure out if you can hold on. You decide to hold on. You do hold on. The market eventually recovers. But you never forget that kitchen table. And 30 years later, when someone says, property always goes up, you smile, and you don't fully believe them. Fourth pattern, Gen X. Australians are the generation most likely to be silently supporting multiple other people financially and least likely to talk about it. Adult children who've been priced out of housing, aging parents who weren't covered by superannuation that didn't become compulsory until 1992. Sometimes both at once. The Australian Institute of Family Studies has documented the phenomenon of Gen X as the sandwich generation, financially responsible for the generation above and the generation below simultaneously, with almost no formal support structure built around it. The psychological dynamic here is what researchers call compulsive responsibility. When your early experiences taught you that systems fail, that safety is fragile, and that the people around you might fall if you don't catch them, you absorb financial responsibility as a kind of identity. Letting someone go under when you could have helped feels like a moral failure, not just a choice. And so they carry it quietly. They don't complain, they don't post about it. They just quietly redirect money that should be building their own security and use it to patch holes in other people's lives, because they know from experience what it feels like when nobody catches you. Fifth pattern, and possibly the most underrated. Gen X Australians are the most aggressively self-reliant investors of any generation, and also the least likely to take investment advice from anyone, including qualified professionals. The productivity, commissions reviews of the superannuation system have consistently found that Gen X members are overrepresented in the group of Australians who've actively moved super into self-managed funds. They want to hold the lever themselves. This is called locus of control compensation. When you've been through experiences where the outcome was entirely outside your control, job loss, interest rate spikes, institutional collapses, your psyche responds by trying to own the controllable levers wherever it can find them, even if self-managing is technically suboptimal, even if a financial advisor might generate better returns. Control has a value that doesn't appear in a rate of return calculation. And honestly, given what this generation watched happen to people who trusted other people to manage their money, can you blame them? Here's what ties all of this together. Australian Gen X doesn't have contradictory money habits. They have perfectly coherent money habits, calibrated for a world where the floor can drop out at any time, where institutions lie, where property can turn against you, where your job can evaporate, and where nobody is coming to help. Every weird behaviour is an adaptation. The obsessive saving isn't anxiety, it's armour. The property obsession isn't greed, it's finding the one thing that held after everything else collapsed. The institutional mistrust isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. The compulsive self-reliance isn't a personality flaw, it's a completely logical response to a generation that reached for the ladder and found out it wasn't bolted to anything. The core insight is this: Gen X didn't become financially complicated because they failed. They became financially complicated because they learned, earlier and harder than most, that the world doesn't keep its promises. And they built a life around never needing it to. Here's the question I want to leave you with. If you grew up watching this generation, or if you are this generation, how much of your money behavior right now is actually about your present circumstances? And how much is muscle memory from a moment that happened 30 years ago? Drop that in the comments. I want to know. Next week, we're looking at why millennial Australians are making the opposite financial bets to Gen X, and why both groups are responding rationally to completely different versions of the same broken promise. Because in the end, your money habits aren't about money. They're about what the world taught you to expect.